Okay, great. And as I say, a real huge thank you for those who turned up. I suggest there's nothing terribly exciting on the television, or alternatively, as it quite properly should, that there's a real passion and interest in local government in this fantastic city. I'm going to introduce all of the panellists. They've got names in front of them. I'll introduce myself first of all. My name's Colin Manners. I'm one of the Pro-Vice-Chancellors at the University of York. It happens my discipline is I'm a Professor of Political Science, but that's not why I'm here, and it's not actually what I do at the university. I sit in a lot of meetings. The positions I will refer to are the geographical positions and not the political ones. So, although there might be some coincidence, you can decide yourself. On the extreme right is Councillor Keith Aspden, who has recently become leader of the Liberal Democrat group. Like at least a couple of other people on the panel, he's a former student of the University of York, a graduate of York, and now works in education at Tadcaster Grammar School. I think he's been on the council for about 10 years. People never leave York in the which is great. James Alexander next to him is quite so recently elected as the member of the leader group, and is, again, he started as the youngest Labour leader.
He started as the youngest councillor in the country.
Is it? Right, crikey. Yeah. Ian, you're in trouble. James was the youngest Labour leader of a council, and he wasn't because somebody died, or somebody came on and somebody resigned or died, so he's again now. And he's making great changes in the city, some of which I'm sure you want to ask about. Next to him is Claire North, who is the proprietor of two businesses in York, namely Cabra Verde Tapas, restaurant on Peter Lane, and Declare Deli on Lendal. Opening hours are?
8 till 6, Monday to Saturday.
And menus will be available as you can. And surprisingly, she's on her honeymoon, I gather. David, her husband's over there. I'm not sure what this says about your marriage. No. He's a confident man if he thinks he can get away with this as your honeymoon trip.
He's promised me something in January.
It's particularly good to have Claire also as a voice of small businesses in the city of York. On my left is Councillor Andy Dagorn, who is the leader of the Green Group on the City Council again. He's been on 10 years. And he's a careers advisor at York College. On his left, again, geographically, positionally, not necessarily politically, is Gary Jones, who is the Chief Executive of York CBS, who, I think I can volunteer this because it's something we'd all agree, is an organisation that does fantastic work with the community and voluntary groups in York. And certainly I know our students are heavily involved in many community-based things in the City of York, and it's something we encourage. And finally, as of course another youngest councillor in the country, we have Ian Gillis, who is the leader of the Conservative group, who's a relative newcomer since he's only been on the council 6 years, but I think his presence is very clear to understand. Okay, we've got a number of questions, as some people couldn't come this evening, and nevertheless their questions I think are equally valid. And I'm going to wrap all of the questions up into one. Nobody actually asked this question, but I think implicitly all of them are asking this question. And that is, why does local government matter? Not many people are interested, not many people vote. Those who do vote tend to reflect their opinions about Westminster politics. So why do we worry so much about local government? James?
Well, I think local government is important because it is one of the closest representative bodies that exist that people can democratically elect to make certain decisions. Sometimes in Westminster I feel there's a bit of a disconnect with ordinary people about what's happening on their everyday lives, what's happening on their streets and in their communities. But with councillors of all political parties, they're much closer to living in those communities, not being in London all week, and understanding what's going on. But also there is a history to local government in terms of how we used to control police, fire services, health services and so on. And a lot of these functions like public health are now coming back to councils. So actually, more and more, councils have responsibilities over local service delivery, either through themselves or through working with partners. And actually, councils need to become leaders of communities and places, rather than just simply looking at administering services and being really bureaucratic. And so I think it's incredibly important that people can elect their representatives to actually do what they said they were going to do and make that difference. And I know that sounds corny, but that's why I'm so adamant about us delivering on our manifesto pledges, because that's what we were elected to do, even the unpopular ones. People put their faith in us to be able to make sure that we deliver on that, and that's something we should do, and hopefully that installs a sense of trust that means in the future people will look more at manifestos in York, they will look more at what politicians promise, and actually see that their vote means something different. And I'm very proud of some things, like the living wage wouldn't happen if, my administration wasn't here in the council, and that's people, voted for an ethos, and that ethos transferred into that policy. Some things they'll agree with, and some things they won't.
Is it more important on Westminster politics or less?
I think it's increasingly becoming more important. I mean, what I found fascinating is the recent debates that happened about directly elected mayors. And when you look at what's happening around the country where directly elected mayors were created, a number of MPs actually stood down from Westminster to go for those positions. And directly elected mayors have exactly the same powers as I do, apart from one, which is my budget can fail on a simple majority and theirs is 2/3 majority. But apart from that, it is the same job. And if there was that thought amongst those MPs that that was the direction to go in, it shows the direction of travel, that increasingly, under a government that's not my party political persuasion, localism and devolution is becoming more and more
Great, so
important.
that's tomorrow's headline, is it? Councillor Alexander says his wish is to be mayor of York and not an MP. Is that right?
No, not at all. Directly elected mayors, I think long-term may make sense if you start actually bringing together democratic accountability of all public services amongst the place. But at the moment it doesn't. You can end up with what the French call a cordon sanitaire, which is where the mayors of one party, the councils of another, they veto each other and nothing actually happens. And I don't think that works. You either do it or you don't.
I'm going to cut you off there because you're giving too long for the others to think of their answers. Liberal Democrats have always seen local politics as being their key arena. Is that your view as well?
Yeah, I think on the initial question we'll probably mostly agree that local government does matter, and actually I think people on the whole underestimate how much it can impact on their lives. And most people involved in politics would say that council leaders certainly have a lot more power and a lot more influence than the vast majority of members of parliament in terms of actually making decisions, making financial decisions and changing people's lives on a day-to-day basis. But I think for me as a Liberal Democrat, I would say that local government should matter even more, and there's still a job to do in terms of making sure that parish councils or local councils actually get more powers and get the opportunity to make even more decisions about their local area. And then when that happens, hopefully it will help engage more people in the democratic process, in knowing who their councillor is, in talking to us about it. Some of that has shifted and is coming across to councils, but I would say a lot more can be done. Could be removed from Westminster and entrusted to local authorities to make a lot more decisions.
Yeah, presumably the Conservatives don't quite share that view since they're taking away lots of money and not really giving them very many.
They're just making sure it's spent properly, Colin. I think the getting back to the question, why do people engage in local politics or don't engage? I think on a local level, people like somebody to blame. And I think if they've got somebody that lives locally and they can easily get in contact with, I think that helps. I think the situation as far as the local politics side, we have the local agenda. It's not, and people are interested in getting, the bins emptied, the streets cleaned, being kept safe, and to a lesser extent to the education side. And I think the situation is that whereas in Westminster, MPs are charged under the whipping system with, national politics and Europe and all the rest of it, whereas here it's far more tangible in a lot of people's eyes. You know, it's what you see every day as you go around York in our case. But it is interesting that people come to me in the, you know, when I'm having a pint in the snug at night and say, this bloody council is this. And to a lot of people, I am the council, you know, or we all are the council. Whether we're in charge or whether we're in opposition or whatever, and people see the council as an entity and don't always necessarily split the various political groups. And some people say, well, why do we have politics in local government? You know, you need a concerted opinion by several people to actually get things through. So whether it's the Labour, Liberal Democrats or Conservatives or Greens, or whether it's the red, white, blue, pink party, it's immaterial. You need enough people of a similar mind in order to move things forward. And so on that basis, parish councils, for instance, Keith mentions parish councils. I've got 7 parish councils in my ward, and when you go to some are excellent. Others are, you would think they were running America, the amount of work that they put into things. But nevertheless, they all have a place, and it's all voluntary. And a lot of people want to do what they think right for the area in which they live, and good luck to them on that. And I think we're all on it. Well, certainly I speak for myself, and I think I speak for everybody, not for personal gain, but you know, just to try and make a difference. You know, I'm not, at the end of the day, people will forget me the day after I'm gone, but that's, you know, I kid myself that I do try.
Okay, along with Claire's menu at the end of the meeting, there will be the name and address of the pub that so you can go and have a pint in the moment. Is the Green a political party or a pressure group?
It's the Green is a political party, very much so. We have about 130 principal councillors across the country. We have one MP now, as of 2011 elections in Brighton. So, yeah, we are very much a political party. And in terms of the question about why does local government matter, we very much put into practice the principles about thinking globally and acting locally and actually making a difference on the ground. All the parties now, I mean, since I got elected 10 years ago, you know, every party wants to be green, or at least have some green wash to its policies. But if it wasn't for the Green Party pushing that agenda, then there would be no incentive for them to do that. And I mean, that applies very much on the local level as much as it does everywhere else. You know, I mean, the Liberal Democrats do have a bit of a reputation for, you know, concern about the environment. But when I first became a councillor, the fact that we got elected, even though the Liberal Democrat administration, that made a big difference in terms of the changes that we see in the city, the improvements, the recycling, the solar panels, the renewable energy, all those sorts of issues which are our core concern about the environment and the planet, are taken seriously if we have elected representatives putting that forward, you know, and challenging the other parties to their seats if they don't actually sharpen up their act and deliver on those issues. We are also very much a party concerned about social issues as well, and social inclusion, opposing the austerity measures that this current government has put in place, and that the Labour Party nationally is committed to continuing if they're re-elected at the next general election. So we're very much challenging those and looking to alternatives to benefits cuts and attacks on the poorest in society to try and pay out for the mistakes of bankers.
Gary, is there any point in having local government for you, since you now provide many of the services which the public sector is no longer funded to provide?
Yes, there is. It's very clear answer. For me, the key word in this question is, why does a local government matter? And you could substitute that for, why does local business matter? Why does local voluntary sector matter? And it comes back to people in positions of power, whether they have that power through funding, because they hold all the money, through taxes, or whether they have that power because they're there to put in place the law or regulate or whatever. they make decisions based on that power. Those decisions have an impact on people, on all of us. And those decisions are never perfect. So the impact is never perfect. So there should always be some mechanism of feeding back to improve and make sure that those decisions in the future get better and better, and we can move more and more towards a society that's more amiable and happy for all of us. And the further away the decision is from the impact, the more rubbish that feedback is, basically. And we live in a country that is highly centralised, one of the most highly centralised countries in the world, and it means that loads of decisions get made in Westminster, they have an impact on us, and we never even get heard. So the impact never even gets heard back in Westminster. So for me, local government is the bit of government that actually does that rather well, by comparison, could do it better, should be given more responsibility from central government, and should then pass that responsibility on further down to local communities, whether that's parish councils, community groups. So that's what's at the hub of this for me, is about decisions have impact on people, and you've got to make sure that those are tightly coupled, and local is the way to do it.
Does it matter to you as a small business?
Well, I think local government is the kind of the face of when you're in small businesses that can make your life easier or harder. And if I'm honest, local government for a lot of small businesses is seen as a barrier to getting on and to doing business. It's any interface with local government can often start with kind of a very negative approach. I don't think I've ever had a deal with local government that started with, how can I help you? What can I do for you? How can we make this happen? It's always been, we've got 2 restaurants. The second restaurant, we just wanted to open, we got planning permission, but the hoops and the loops that we had to go through because of an interpretation within local government, instead of saying, this is great, you're opening a new business, you're going to employ these people, you've done all the right things. We were asked questions where we were going to put the cycle rack in a little restaurant off a little street in the middle of York. And I think from a small, speaking on behalf of my neighbours and the small businesses, we just find there's a real disconnect between what we're trying to do and interfacing with local government. And I'm yet to find somebody who says, how can I help you?
Okay, good in practice, good in theory, but there's some irritant in practice. We'll come back to that, I think, once or twice. We need to make the answers fairly sharp, and I'm going to make the next question fairly sharp as well. Should there be more houses in York, and if so, where? If you're a Green councillor, the answer would be?
Should there be more houses in York? Yes, we do need more houses, and there are a number of sites around the city that already have planning permission where the house building is stalled since the recession. And I'm sure all the councillors here will be very keen to see that move forward as quickly as possible and to put those houses in place. I can mention Terry's site, Great Sugar site, Hungate. There are these sites around the city, but brownfield sites that need houses on them, and those brought back into use. We want more houses, but we also want them to be sustainable, both in terms of the environment, but also the cost and the social inclusion. So we want affordable houses in the city. We're stuck with a system that means that at present, it's very difficult to build council houses and social housing. This council, to its credit, is doing some council house building, but the local plan, which we may have a separate question on, I don't know, proposes 22,000 new houses in the next 20 years, which means expanding the city massively when we don't have the infrastructure to support that. So there's no point building houses if they're not sustainable in terms of the sewerage, the transport, all the other systems that need to go with that. And that would be our concern.
Are all the 4 political parties as of one mind on this?
No. Do you want to?
Please.
Okay. Well, basically, when you look at what's happened in York with regards to what's called a local plan, we've never had a local plan since 1956. And to put it into context, That was 4 years before my mother was born. And that means not having a local plan means you don't have a certain amount of certainty in your planning function, and then you get some of the problems that you mentioned by saying what that future of the city is going to be. You know, where are these homes going to be built, and how, and where's the employment sites going to be? You end up with no long-term vision for what the city needs to be able to represent the needs of people who live here and future generations. And when you look at our record of house building in this city, and there may be arguments over why that's the case, there's been negligible numbers of homes built over quite a few years, or appropriate sized homes for that matter. And therefore, being an attractive place to live, which York is, you end up in a situation where demand for homes is far, far outstripping supply. So there's a rise in the cost of housing. And when you look at rent prices, let alone prices to be able to buy property, the rent prices are going through the roof. My rent is £675 a month, and that makes up a significant percentage of my income. And you know, we've got a number of young people here now. I don't know how you're going to be able to afford to buy your own homes in York, and I know that I currently can't. And I'm supposed to be the fat cat in charge of the council, and probably on more wages than most people in this city. And so therefore, you do need more homes. So the argument becomes where? Now when you look at brownfield sites, I mean, Andy mentioned a few of them. Terry's has just been bought by a new owner that clearly wants to get it developed and get new homes. Hungate, we've attracted Hiscox there, which stimulated development, which then can sort out the rest of the homes on that site. And we have a number of brownfield sites across the city where progress is now being made. It's slow, but it is being made nonetheless. However, even when you build on all of those brownfield sites, and clearly in a place like York, you're not going to build really high because of views of the minister and so on. You haven't got enough homes in this city to satisfy the current demand of people in York or their future generations. So then it becomes a question of what land do you then put in. And the planning inspector recently said that we only have 4 years land supply for new homes. The government said you need a minimum of 5. And to have a local plan that stacks up and defines our green belt for the first time so you don't have uncontrolled development, you have to therefore put in more homes. And I would say that putting in some of the larger settlements which are proposed actually means you've got more of a chance of getting infrastructure put in there, which then satisfies those communities rather than just simply pegging on all the time expansions of existing settlements.
And the same through the Conservative Party?
Yeah, I think obviously it's not about, we hear this term affordable houses and building affordable houses. What we need to do is build houses. Yes, okay, by nature of the different types of development, there will be some that are affordable. We need to obviously fill up the brownfield sites first, and there's some greenfield sites where it would be appropriate to build on, that there is no doubt. But the numbers are just ridiculous that's in the local plan. However, there's a lot of stuff in the local plan that would change communities, and that can't be right. And there's many contradictory factors, or contributory factors, should I say, why houses haven't been built in York. I mean, the financial situation is one. But the affordable housing policy that's been pushed by both this administration and the previous administration has actually led to developers not building. Where a developer has to build 50% affordable on a development of over 15 houses or on a development of over 2 in a rural area, it doesn't exactly encourage them to build the homes. And especially when land prices have been, as they have historically been in the last, say, 10 years. And many developers have bought land which is actually at the top of the market. The market has dropped a bit, and they are not. It's not feasible to build on that particular land from a financial aspect. I'm talking about now. So yes, we've got to get that moving. There's various ways we can get it moving. But at the end of the day, 22,000 new homes is just a figure that's been plucked from the air. So, but we do need to build homes.
What do the Lib Dems stand on?
I think broadly all the opposition parties on the one hand agree that the figure of 22,000 homes across the city over the period of the local plan is just far too high based on infrastructure, the drainage, and actually what the communities of York actually want. It's one of the big things when you go and talk to people in all of the villages and communities around York, is that they do not want, the reason many of them came to York which is being special, having green views, having a feeling of space, not being in a huge city, destroyed in a plan. My concern with the way this has been tackled is that there was a draft local plan in place under the previous council, and Labour came in and rightfully wanted to review it. They have taken some consultants' reports, plucked the figures, as Ian said, out of the air, pitched them above what any of the consultants have said, and are now putting forward this plan that will have huge effects for decades to come. What we should be doing is, yes, looking obviously to build and grow the city, but we should be working with communities to actually bring that about. And I think people generally agree, yes, brownfield sites, you've got to maximise the use of brownfield sites, you've got to include windfall sites, because often new sites come up and are available in York, and also you've got to capitalise on any new government funding around building more council housing in particular, as well as the affordable housing. But although we need growth, the figures and plans that are being proposed are far beyond what the city can cope with, and certainly the current infrastructure in parts of the city can cope with. And I think the council will get a shock when the local plan goes to inquiry, because it simply isn't sustainable, and they'll have a really tough job at arguing that. So I hope that now we're getting to the end of the consultation period, that they will have a look again at the plans, at the figures and at the sites, and just make it a little bit more sustainable before it has that effect in York.
Presumably the business community are supporting more houses for a more vibrant economy and more customers for your restaurants? Or?
I don't think I've ever really thought about it in those terms. I mean, I think I probably agree that what we don't want is York to expand at a rate that we don't recognise York anymore, and I think that's the danger of these big developments happening, that what brought me to York from London was because it was a city you could walk around, it was what it was, and living in a city like that, house prices are going to be a bit more expensive. There is a trade-off for those sort of things, and you have to accept that. And I think, just building more houses and I hope that you're going to bring prices down, I think is probably a bit naive, because I'm not sure that's how it would work. It might just drag more people in because coming into the city, and I think we've got a great city, and I'm very loath to see it radically changed or enlarged, really.
If you build homes without the affordable housing element, you would attract people who can afford those homes to York and wouldn't go to York residents. That's not what the local plan is about. And affordable housing targets, there's never been a prerequisite saying you have to have 50% affordable housing. It's been, this is what we would like. If someone comes along and says, this is 5%, it's the only way it can make it stack up financially. The council said yes. I don't see that as a problem, being able to try and get affordable housing for your residents. And I know, Keith, you're saying you've spoken to villagers and they're concerned that they come to York and that's the views that they have. But what about people who are born and brought up in this city, in Tanghall, in Chapelfields, who currently are saying to me that they're giving up hope of even renting their own home, let alone buying a home? Surely they should be given some help. Surely they should be able to help get a home of their own, even if it's rental. And in terms of maximising brownfield sites, I understand where you're coming from, Keith. What you're talking about is high density housing. And I think that that doesn't create good communities. It doesn't create a situation whereby people feel that they are a part of a community. You end up feeling you're just put in some kind of box somewhere. I don't think that's appropriate. The government, new government's legislation and guidance with regards to that has reduced it. And with regards to rate of expansion, what we're actually talking about is 1.8% more draft greenbelt land than the previous plan. I don't think that's huge. If you want to look at reality from now, it's 4.4%. But if that solves our homes crisis, I think that's the right thing to do.
The word community has been mentioned quite a lot. Community is one of your raison d'etre. Is this helping?
Is there a big problem with the difference between renting and buying in York? Yes, massive. Are there loads of people who want to move here and increase the demand? Yes. Is there lots of existing residents for which, if they term affordable housing, that means that actually most of the housing now is unaffordable, which is a kind of a bonkers statement, really. So it means that one of our basic human needs, shelter over our heads, for most people is unaffordable, i.e. unattainable. they were not going to get one of their basic human needs, which is it's just a very strange phrase, I think. I know it's not James's phrase, it's a commonly used phrase. This issue of housing is just so much more complicated than we can really begin to get to grips with. Even the local plan is however many thousands of pages. I mean, I just wonder if anyone in this building has even actually read it all. It's so complicated. Some of that is imposed on you by central government. There's just such big issues. There's national population, migration levels. There's a whole load of stuff about demographics and loads of more people living on their own where they would have stayed with families or married or been living with other people. There's a whole load of stuff about the fact that so many jobs and careers now are city focused, which is why people are moving more and more to cities. And I just feel really torn on it as an issue, because I think from a kind of ground up community level, when I say yes, of course we should build houses for people that need them, but on another level, I don't want York to turn into London, because actually that ain't why I moved here, and that isn't why most people live here. So I think unless we have some of the more fundamental conversations about this kind of growth-driven economy towards bigger and bigger cities all the time and more service industry, we're missing half the argument with housing, I think. Okay,
I'm going to take a quick straw poll, and the way of doing these things, there's a little acronym called BANANA, isn't there, on this sort of area, which will absolutely nothing near anyone at all. Who's persuaded by the argument that it would be nice if you could restrict it to green the brownfield sites, but the reality is you need to upset people and move into other areas, and if the consequences might change the character of York, then that's the price that has to be paid for giving people the opportunities that James described. Who would favour that view?
Depends what the other options are.
The other option is the more restrictive one, that you actually concentrate housing where it doesn't have that same environmental impact.
That's also not an option. The government hasn't given us that option.
Well, let me see the preference. Who would prefer that latter view? Still a bit of work to do. Okay.
I think one of the things, Colin, that's changed in York over the last few years, well, the last sort of 30 years, is the advent of the success, to be fair, of the universities. And, James mentioned Town Hall. Well, I was a Town Hall lad. I was brought up in Town Hall, managed by my own house. But when I was in Town Hall, there was no York University as such. And of course, the profile of the Town Hall area, York area, Osborwick area, has changed dramatically because of the university. Now, we celebrate the success of universities, but it's had quite a big effect on the housing and we mentioned communities before, of the communities in certain areas of York.
Well, why is it right for your generation to be able to own their own home, but we should be excluding people of my generation? Because I'm sure we both work as hard as each other. I don't think that's right.
Well, my daughters are of your generation, they both own their own homes.
What we're in danger of is we already have a key council officer, senior officer commuting from Scarborough so many days a week. He doesn't do a full week any longer. We're in danger of becoming like Cambridge, and people who work in Cambridge, whether it's Microsoft or university, live at places like Kings Lynn and commute. Cambridge is unaffordable. You want that to happen in York.
Okay,
It's not because you can't afford to live here, I'm sure.
I think we will. I'm not sure. We're not going to personal case.
Exactly.
Right. Let's pursue. One thing that Ian just said is, when you mentioned my institution, there are lots of benefits. Things that bring benefits also bring challenges. One of the things that bring benefits is the fact that we've got a major new financial company going to relocate here, a major departmental store going to locate around here. Does the council spend all of its time courting the big players, the big employers, and forgetting local homegrown businesses?
That's part of the problem.
Not really.
When you look at this, a question to Claire.
I don't know. I mean, from my interface, and this is not wishing to be a negative, my interface with the council isn't a positive experience, and there's never been anything that said to me, how can we make your business better? How can we, the rates are set by the government, but they have become a massive part of our income. We have to, we're a small business, and So, it's almost sometimes it's, 10% of what we sell in a day, just to put the money into the till to pay the rates. So, yes, I think it's great that you get new businesses in. There can be a debate about whether John Lewis at French Cross is the right place for it to be, but that's probably another question. But I think from a small business point of view, there's very little that I see from the council that is directed at small businesses. A couple of years ago, there used to be a city centre manager. At least there was somebody who seemed to have some overall view of what was going on. And he's no longer there. Obviously, that's part of probably cutbacks. But I just think a mindset that says, what can we do to help rather than...
Ian used to be a small businessman.
Yes, and I think it's interesting that the current group, there's not many of them have actually risked any of their own money in running the business, as I have. And the situation is that, it's up to us to facilitate as a council, to facilitate. People want to come here because it's a successful city, and that's why John Lewis and the rest want to come here. And that's fine, I've got no problem with that. Where I have a problem with is that we need to facilitate as much as we facilitate those big boys and rightly so, and we have to facilitate the small business people. Now, the point is that coming into York, to park in York, is costing an absolute fortune. And, you've got to balance that. And there's people, the trends are that we'll go out to an out-of-town shopping centre, we'll park outside and we'll go in. And if I voted against that, my wife would kill me, well, she did actually. But the situation is that that's what people want these days, and you've got to go with those trends. Might be unfortunate, but it's not something that we can change. But the small businesses in this city, there used to be far more than there are now. And they're being edged out for all sorts of reasons. And we need to look after those small businesses. It's the same as the market. I have a problem with the market because I don't think the market traders have done themselves any good over the years. But, the market is a jewel in York's Crown, or it should be. We should be encouraging ways to move that market forward. And the traders that come in there, because I think the offer at the moment is not great. But to actually put up parking charges at every year and use it as a cash cow puts people off, and that's not good. So they do need help. The rates, I agree with you as far as the rates are concerned. But a lot of
bus fares as well. We're bringing down bus fares as well.
Bus fares? Well, yeah, the situation with bus fares, use it to lose it, and when it comes to bus fares, it becomes subsidies. But at the end of the day, whilst it's very good to get people cycling, and as a keen cyclist, I use my bike on a Saturday, but the situation, not everybody wants to go on the bike, not everybody wants to use a bus, they want to get in the car. Now it may well be that you penalise them by charging the tax on fuel and from a national perspective, and charging massive fees to come in and park your car, but to use it as a cash cow is wrong. And the situation as far as bus fares are concerned, we could have lots of buses, but you know as well as I do, Andy, that buses, it's feast or famine. It's like taxis. You need them at midnight on a taxis. You need midnight on a Saturday night, but for much of the rest of the time they're lying idle. And buses are the same. You need to get people to work and home from work, but during the day, the big buses are running around York and they're virtually empty. And it's not all to do with bus fares, because many people like myself have bus passes. And I don't use them because they're not, a lot of the time they're not convenient, especially when you want to go from A to B to C to D.
Okay, so you have a council leader, you're flirting with the bigger companies and ignoring and making life difficult for those who are local. Is that fair?
I think when I initially became council leader, my focus was about trying to attract businesses and jobs into York. And then I realised very quickly that actually you get far more sustainable and larger economic growth by supporting existing businesses to expand and supporting startups than you do getting those jobs in. And that's where our focus has shifted. And if you look at the unemployment rate that was issued today, and just a couple of hours ago, the Centre for Cities report came out saying we're the second lowest unemployment rate in any city in the country. It shows that actually the jobs that aren't even really here yet at Hiscox, or the jobs that John Lewis is bringing on stream, that are not even showing in those figures, and actually that unemployment rate going down is actually because of increase of existing jobs. Now, there is an issue about small to medium enterprises and the support that they're given. For a start, a lot of retailers, and I know retail is only one sector of that, A lot of the outgoings are controlled by the rents, which the council doesn't control, and I think personally the rents are too high. When I speak to landlords, they say that you have to have ever-increasing rents, because if you don't, then it shows that your city is failing. And I think that puts a lot of strain on new startups and on existing businesses. On the rates issue, I think there's a wider question about resources to local government to be able to support business, because I would like us to have our fair share of business rates. We collect more business rates than we actually get to be able to keep. We give 40 million pounds of business rates to London that we don't get back. Now, why can't I use that money to lower your business rates? That would really help you, but I can't. And yet Scotland, which has a population the same as Yorkshire and Humber, and Yorkshire and Humber's got an economy double the size of Wales, can. New start-up businesses in Scotland, such as a cafe or a deli or whatever, they are allowed 1 year's free business rates. And I don't think that's a fair allocation. And Ian's right about car parking charges. I think it's too expensive. The difficulty is that successive council administrations have seen it as a way to be able to get money into transport, to support buses, admittedly sometimes through subsidies, like what Andy's saying. And actually, therefore, councils rely too much on that car parking income. But when 60% of our income comes from council tax, 40% comes from the government, and that 40% is being cut 45%, simply lowering car parking charges means something else has to be cut off. And what is that?
Okay, go.
I don't know about whether individual companies that the council's been talking to, whether that's right or wrong. I've got concerns about Primark, which I've spoken just today with James about, and I think he shares some of those concerns, as lots of us would, because of very high-profile stuff that's been in the media about practice back in, I don't know if it's India or Pakistan, about where the clothes are made. I suppose you might call me an idealist, but I would go back and say it shouldn't really just be about numbers of jobs. Jobs are really to do two things, I think. They're a livelihood, to get some money so that you can pay your rent, to buy your food. But they also should be about meaningful work, contribution to society. So I worry that we have more and more and more mind-numbingly boring retail, shelf stacking and call centre type jobs across the country, not just in York.
I like working in retail.
Well, that may well be the case, and I'm not putting a blanket across all of retail. I've worked in it myself as well. But generally speaking, I think there are more and more of the kinds of jobs where we treat people like drones rather than like individuals that want to develop some kind of craft and skill and contribute their knowledge and expertise and be an individual within the world. And I think the council does have a role in terms of jobs within the city. I would like to see more of that aspirational stuff about the types of work and the types of sectors and things in York. You know, there's great stuff in York, the heritage sector, obviously the chocolate industry, which is a great craft in itself. I would like to see more of that.
Okay, we've got your second headline there for tomorrow's paper, and that is the council leader now aspires to become a shopkeeper. Okay, so we'll have to make the choice with that and that. There's a question from the audience, from Tony Martin. I think probably we'll only need one or two answers to it, because it's a fairly specific question, but it does tie in with what you were saying about getting into the city of York, but in a different way.
It's unfair to make it specific, because it is a specific right. Anybody saw the letter in the press the other day. You want me to stand by it?
Please, if you just, so you can be seen on the camera, and then...
Yes, I mean, it's to do with communication. I'm secretary of the Waterway March, the IWA and Waterways Association, and York's always had very, very minimal facilities for boaters visiting York, and more since I've lived here, and I've been involved with the IWA for 10 years actively, is that visiting visitors to York, and a lot of people now live on boats because of the economy, visitors to York all year round, Marygate Landing and so on. There are problems, obviously, with a lot of loving that, we're not going to touch on that, is that in his infinite wisdom, and I'm wondering about the wisdom because I've been on the Grady's Court inquiry as an observer from the local planning panel, and some of the criteria set against that establishment have been set against this other establishment.
You can make the question fairly straight.
It would never have happened in the first place. There were very basic, and it's historic, to the old British waterways, facilities in York You could fill your tank with water, you could empty your loo, you could go to the loo and leave rubbish. And when 6 years ago, the people doing that development, the pub, restaurant, which I believe is going to go by the end of this month, went to that planning meeting, the South West Planning Panel, and the stipulations very clearly stated that they had to reinstate those facilities.
Right.
That was agreed to. They had put temporary facilities in, which are now gone. We have talked to their partners, which is the York Museum and Galleries Trust.
Can I ask you to sort of just focus the question
the
then,
council,
please?
we talked to developers. I've been doing this over a 3-week period at all sorts of levels. We do need some reassurance, and voters are coming up to me at Boat Festival at Watford at the end of July.
Okay.
That we have absolutely no assurance at all that this is going to be reinstated.
Well, let's see if we can get it. Okay. The question is then, will there be a commitment to reinstall the facilities?
The commitment's there in writing, but nothing on the plan.
Okay.
This actually reflects this reflects a wider problem about the detail on things, planning issues and other facilities the council provides, being able to ensure that we don't lose the wood for the trees, if you saw what I mean. When there are big developments happening, yes, we want them to happen, we want to see them in place, but we do need to make sure that some of the little detail which can make a really big difference to people's everyday lives, whether it's a local business or where somebody lives, we've got to look after that as well as the big picture.
I think the argument is very clearly expressed. I'm very interested in.
I think it's quite simple, really, because I sat on that planning application, and the situation is quite simply that if it's a condition of the planning that those facilities are left there, then it's up to everyone concerned to make sure that they are. The place isn't even open yet. But the thing is, if it's not, then it becomes an enforcement issue, and if it's a condition, it has to be adhered to. If it's not, it needs to be sorted.
Anything you want to add?
Well, I don't know the specific case, but I'm happy to look into it. I've been interested in the waterways for some time. I mean, about a year ago, I saw a map of the waterways in terms of who owned what bit of water. I found it fascinating that planning law is completely different on water than it is on land. And there's so much more we could do. We could have permanent moorings for more boat homes. We could have more of temporary moorings for regards to business, as you say. On the specific case, I will look into it. I'm still chasing up another enforcement notice though, about the takeaway at the end of Bridge Street over their signage, which has been going through courts for some time, but I'll definitely look into it.
Okay, not everybody, I hope that was helpful. Not everybody knows the technicalities about that particular case, but the one thing you will all know about is the next question, because there were more people asked this than any other question. Why have we closed Lendal Bridge? What are you doing with the money? Why have you got holes in the road, and why are you not sweeping my streets when you were... One person said that we were fined 5 times in a single day. So, what are you doing about that?
Sure, okay. Well, local government is in a very difficult financial situation in general. When you look at cuts to government departments, they've had cuts around 7%-ish. Don't quote me on that figure, but it's relatively low over the course of this parliament. And councils have taken a far, far greater brunt of that, because there is a perception amongst some people in Westminster, and amongst probably a large section of the population, that thinks that we're all wasteful organisations, wasting money.
So it's a revenue exercise and not a traffic matter?
No. Let me explain the financial part, because I don't often get these opportunities to explain how the finances work, because a lot of people will believe that their council tax pays for all the services that they get, and therefore they say, why are my council tax going up when the services are going down? They don't understand that actually that only contributes to 60% of our expenditure, and the rest comes from government, literally through taxation, but not through taxation that we control. And it's that that's being cut 45%. And when you actually then have reductions in funding of that scale, mixed with increased demand for things like adult social care, the actual cuts that we're doing ends up being higher than 45%. So over the course of this parliament, the cuts that we are initiating in York is about half our
I think the question was about Lendal Bridge, not about Conservative policies. So
no, but what you did ask is why are the streets clean, why are potholes, and that is why it's because of some of that funding.
The question was about Lendal Bridge.
Lendal Bridge. This was discussed initially by the County Council in 1974 as a potential opportunity to be able to look at trying to reduce traffic in the city centre. Clearly didn't go ahead at that time. About 10 years ago-ish, the council was discussing it again, decided not to go through with it. But I and my colleagues had a manifesto pledge to be taking physical action over congestion without introducing a congestion charge. Something had to give. Now, I know that it's controversial, but so was pedestrianisation. We had people carrying coffins through the city centre at that time saying that it was going to kill the city centre, and that isn't what happened. In fact, you ended up having a more welcoming environment, more people went into it. So what we did is we said, shall we look at a trial that lasts 6 months to be able to restrict private traffic going through here, and what mechanism could be used to enforce that? And also, some people say to me, why didn't you close Ousbridge instead? But actually a high proportion of traffic going through Ousbridge goes to the city centre as the destination.
How much does it raise?
It would have had, I think, I don't know off the top of my head, I think it's been about, well it depends because Coppergate's come in at the same time in terms of enforcement. So I think it's been about £60,000–70,000 a week on average, but don't quote me on the figure, and that's between the two. And Ousbridge would have had a greater impact on city centre businesses than the Lendal Bridge would have done. Now I was expecting far more traffic chaos than has actually been created. There's been an increase in traffic on Foss Islands Road, there's been an increase in traffic along Clifton Bridge, but actually there's been a reduction on Lima Road, a reduction on Lord Mayor's Walk, and a reduction on Bootham and Jubilee, which is not what I expected. It allows taxis to be able to get through, and obviously public transport to get through. Because we don't control the buses, we don't licence them, and we don't regulate them. We haven't done since the 80s. The only thing we can help influence getting people onto buses is actually being able to make sure they're reliable. And if they're snarled up in traffic, and that's why you have bus lanes, then they're not reliable and people won't get on.
Okay, Claire?
I think it's an embarrassment for York because the bad publicity that's been generated over it. And I can't see any real advantage because my shop looks out over Lendal Bridge and I squirm daily by seeing people driving down who genuinely don't see that sign at the end of Lendal that says don't turn left because they've turned left for so long and they go over it, and I just think that's another visitor or another tradesperson or another delivery guy who's gone over Lendal Bridge, and I think if we're going to do it, it should have been so much more clearly done. When I lived in London during when they introduced the congestion charge, and you couldn't miss it. You know, you drove down a road, there was a sign the size of a house, and it stopped you going into the congestion zone. We haven't got it right. I think the revenue must. But I think the revenue must be so much more because I can count. I sit on my phone looking out sometimes. 4 or 5 cars per minute going over Lendal Bridge, and it hasn't made much difference because it's become like a fast track for taxis piling over the bridge. We've got the buses coming over the bridge, we've got the Royal Mail coming over the bridge, we've got the dust vans. And I think if you said to most visitors to York, do you think this bridge is quiet, they wouldn't have noticed any difference. I genuinely, if we're going to do it, I think be bold, close the bridge, you know, do something really radical and make it, you know, a completely pedestrian zone. Then I think that would have had some value. But I think we've got a half-hearted attempt at managing traffic over one small bit of road that's just sending traffic all over the place. I mean, we got married in York 2 weeks ago, and we had friends who are not stupid people who didn't know what to do when they got to the top of when they coming from the north, the south. They just looked at it and then they just sort of dashed off in all various directions. They were staying in hotels in the centre of York, couldn't get to them. My brother spent 25 minutes being talked in by one of the hotels and in the centre of York, because that's the way he'd come in, and he couldn't get to the hotel. It does us no favours. I think we should be bold and say, we'll close it, pedestrianise it like we've done Coney Street and all the others, or we keep it for everybody. But I think the arbitrariness of taxis bombing down there now, they absolutely, I think every taxi in York takes a shortcut over Lendal Bridge now, so you've got all this traffic. I mean, it doesn't seem any quieter to me at all.
I think it is.
Sorry, Keegan, half-baked or a sensible experiment or half-baked and we'll leave them?
I think James attempting to link the closure of Lendal Bridge to government cuts at the start was a little bit extreme.
I was asked why There haven't been clean streets.
Yeah, I'm aware. You're very good at deflecting things, but my main problem with the way that the closure of Lendal Bridge was handled was that the Labour Party had absolutely no mandate to do it. It wasn't in a manifesto, and more importantly, it was not consulted on, and the local businesses were not consulted, the community was not consulted widely, people were not given adequate time and information to be able to deal with a closure that we have now seen sort of day in, day out in the press.
We wrote to every single person in the city. It's been on TV.
If you remember, James, on the morning of the closure, we were on Radio York,
There's 33
and I said
signs around
exactly the same
city.
point that presumably you ignored, that there needed to be more consultation, more information, more adequate signage. You haven't done any of it, and the trouble is that we're now seeing the consequences of people being fined with visiting York. I have many people, I assume the other group leaders do, who are contacting us from outside of the city saying our holidays, our visits have been absolutely ruined due to this policy. And if it is going to remain in place as it is, then the council needs to sort out the signage, needs to sort out the information, and needs to deal with the complaints that we are seeing, because it is that significant an issue in terms of the reputation of York, and we need to grapple with that.
And I could feel you nodding when James was speaking, so I suspect your answer's fairly short and great idea, more of it.
The longest running scrutiny there's ever been in this city spent 4 years looking at how to tackle congestion. The conclusion it came up with was that people wanted something radical doing short of congestion charging. This is exactly what this is. It's policy which has been developed both under a Liberal Democrat administration and a Labour administration. We've got serious air quality issues in this city. We've got streets where people are living, where they're living in an environment which breaches World Health Organization conditions. And up until this action, nothing seriously done to try and address that. This at least is a step in that direction to try and address the issue of air quality. A signage may be right, it may not be exactly the right format.
But the signage you're saying is incompetence rather than mischief.
Is the DFT has regulations. I mean, I'd love to put the signs up that there's congestion charge. That's specific.
I think you have
not
to.
allowed to do it.
I think you have to balance the conservation issues. You don't want to degrade 10-foot high sign up against the city wall,
flashing lights on the minister,
and so on. So there is a balance to be made, and there are regulations, as James said, that have to be complied with, and inevitably there will be teething problems and so on. But I think if you go back to looking at the Alan Simpson's report, The City Beautiful, that was a model, a vision for the city which involved less traffic in the city centre. 40% of traffic through the city centre is not actually got any business there, it's passing through from A to B.
I thought that plan was pedestrianised, that Lendal Bridge, not partly close it, wasn't it?
It may well have been, yes. Yeah. But then we have got the limited number of bridges. We can't afford to be building bridges everywhere. You've got a bus network which is focused on the city centre. So you have to do something to maintain the public transport routes that provide the alternative for the cars, and people who don't want to be bringing their cars in when they don't need to.
You had an interest in taxis, so...
I did have an interest in taxis, and as I said to James when this was first muted, it was done in the early 2000s, I can't remember exactly what, and the traffic disappeared, and there's no doubt about it. You know, Bootham, Gillygate, Lord Mayor's Walk, round by the station, history would tell us that the traffic disappears. Where it goes to, and there was a couple of pinch points, I think one was Crichton Avenue Bridge and one was Walgate Bar, I believe. And you know, I have a certain amount of sympathy with what the Labour group have done in this, because there is no doubt that Lendal Bridge was stacked up with traffic all the time. Now, if the policy is to get rid of that traffic, then Lendal Bridge undoubtedly has worked. You know, there's no two ways about it, because the traffic has disappeared. If the policy is also to get rid of the people that were in those cars, then that's working as well. And I don't know what the impact of that is as yet, and it's too early to tell. What I would say about Lendal Bridge, it's a 6-month experimental period. Now, people have said about the signs, and the signage is absolutely appalling. We've done it half-cocked, we've not done it right. We've people talk about sat-navs. I mean, if they've never got a map these days, what should we do without sat-navs? But at the end of the day, that's the world in which we live. But they rushed it through, and the signage is poor, I've got to say. But, I have certain amounts of sympathy with, you're damned in the city if you do, and you're damned if you don't. And if you go across Lendal Bridge in a car, you could either go up Bootham or up Gilligate. That's the only two ways you could go, unless you're a disabled driver and went into the city. So why people were going across there in the first place could be argued. However, getting back to what I was saying, 6 months, it should be 6 months, and it should be 6 months and not a day more. And the data should be collected from that, and then a more substantial reasoning discussion should take place as to what happens, going on from there. People say about closing Ousbridge. Why would you want to close Ousbridge? I mean, the reason to go across Ousbridge, people get dropped off, to be honest with you. James is right, people go into the city centre. But in real terms, if you're going from west to east, you can't go down Coppergate, because that's against the law. So you would go down to where Scallowgate Bridge comes across the river anyway. So why you need to go over Ousbridge in the first place, I don't know. So that's where I would go. 6 months, not a bit more. It's worth, I won't criticise them for trying, but I think there's a lot of data to come. They certainly got rid of the cars. Whether it's done any damage to city centre trade or not, too early to tell. That's one part of the question. The second part of the question is in potholes and gritting and what have you. We've just given over £500,000 for a transformation programme to directors that get 6-figure sums. We've got details of arse barges, 20-mile-an-hour signs that nobody wants, and we can't find £60,000 to grit the roads. I think that shows you where we are with this lot.
Gary.
As a mere resident and commuter along Hackney Road, Gilligate, over the bridge into town, travelling between 7:30 and 9:30 every day, bike or bus, it is a lot better. It's a lot better than it used to be. So it has a positive impact on my start to every day. So that's a completely partisan view, but for me, it works.
Okay. Unwittingly, Ian gave us a brilliant introduction to the question from the audience, which is...
Well, I changed the question.
Oh, well.
I was going to ask...
It was going to work so well.
I was going to ask about the expenditure of £500,000 on additional management to backfill the failed management that we have at the council at the moment. But I think, to be fair to the audience and to the panel, I would rather ask about parish councils in the city. Because at the moment we have parish councils all around the city, and in the city we don't have them. And what that means is that every time there's any kind of consultation or any idea about localising services, the residents' associations, which are basically small groups around particular communities in the city, are approached as if they are parish councils. So there's no democratic accountability, and to me it seems for 15 quid a year we could easily have parish level governance within the city walls as well as outside.
Okay. Third tier, local authorities in the city centre. Keith,
speaking as a Liberal Democrat, but also as a vice chair of a parish council, I'm a huge fan of what they can do, because I think people underestimate the amount of voluntary effort that parish councillors, parish council staff and people that link into parish councils can do. They can provide a sort of level of community effort and also be a focal point for the community. City of York Council as a sort of party political entity is never going to achieve the sort of level of goodwill and support that parish councils working right in communities can do. I think all communities should be given a choice as to whether they want a parish council, and personally I would like to see the number of parish councils increasing in York, because at the moment you've got parish councils pretty much in the York Outer parliamentary constituency, except Dringhouse and the Mucklehall. And then you haven't got parish councils in the centre of York, and I'd like those communities to consider it. One of the problems it comes down to is when you ask people, do you want to spend an extra £15 or £30 a year, then obviously they question what they get from it, so that you'd have to make the case for what the parish councils would actually deliver in terms of additional services and resources. But in Fulford, the City of York Council, and Ian just mentioned this at the moment, are cutting services like litter bins, like salt bins, like community grants, like support for in bloom groups. They're the things that actually most motivates the community to get involved and work together. And if it wasn't for the parish council, we would be seriously struggling to keep doing those basic street level services. So they are really important.
A very quick point. We used to have a system akin to parish councils until 2 years ago when we made budget cuts to the ward committees. The ward committee system was, although there wasn't a precept, but there was still a process whereby local people, in fact York was acclaimed nationally for good practice, which is now gone because of the cut to the budget, where we used to have an invitation to every resident to deliver through every letterbox to put forward things they'd like to see happen in their ward, and then a ballot of every household to say what they wanted to see happen, and then we actually put that in practice.
So a second fan. Garrett, Ian, you presumably are a fan, are you?
Yes, I am. I mean, I think a lot of people put a lot of work into parish councils. I think there's something wrong when sometimes the precept that's gathered by parish councils, half of it invariably goes to the clerk, and I'm not sure, I would support that. But having said that, I think the parish councils, they do the litter picks, they do all sorts of things, but this authority has never, ever recognised the work that parish councils do. And I think what is really wrong is that they expect parish councils to raise a precept for doing work in the parishes that people in York get for nothing. And I go to the young people, Copperthorpe Poppleton Youth Club is funded through parish councils, and other grants, whereas the youth clubs in the city centre, they get funded centrally from the city council. And that's wrong. So I do believe that once parish councils can raise their own precept, then there's advantages to that. But we put a motion to council last week where we could actually raise, it's called rewiring public services, that all groups on local government association suggested that taxes could be, gathered locally and spent locally. Unfortunately, that was hijacked by others, but leave that to one side. But I do believe there is merit in looking at the parish council side, because they can raise their own precept. And don't forget, all parish councillors are elected.
Exactly.
Gary, are you a fan too?
Yeah, well, I'm a fan of local, so I have to be a fan of parish, or I prefer to see them sort of community council, I suppose, rather than that kind of overtly sort of Church of England label. So yes, the apoliticalness, yeah, I'd actually quite like to see that transfer up as well, because I think the party politics actually gets in the way of most of these guys. The original reason most of them got involved is because they actually care, isn't really to do with the national party politics usually. So I think that might not be a bad idea. I would just take issue with one thing that was said though. So in terms of democracy, what you're aiming is an elected, representative democracy is what you're talking about. But unfortunately, we live in a country where not everyone's registered to vote, even fewer then actually vote, and then even fewer of the people that do vote end up with the person that they voted for having any kind of role. And we're talking quite small percentages by the time you get down to there, which is a real problem. I would say that people's participation within residents groups and other types of community groups is a form of democracy. It's a participative democracy. It's where people actually get up and do something instead of just voting for someone else who they can then blame for the thing they didn't like. So I think there's a role for both. I'd like to see in each area a community council working very closely with residents groups and other community groups locally.
There we are. James, you've got an obvious vote winner. All the other political parties very keen on it. There must be something that's on your agenda.
Parish councils do a huge amount of work in the city, and they need to be recognised for that. They do it, out of goodwill and because they care about their communities. This government, to be fair to them, I'm never a fan, have actually made it easier for people to set up parish councils, and if people want to set them up and campaign for them, they should be entitled to do. However, it does come back to the question Keith says, it's about paying additional council tax for that, and what benefit is there in that additional representation. Where I have some slight issues is with regards to something that Gary's raised, with regards to democratic accountability. Because I don't know when the most recent parish council elections were, but the one I looked into quite vigorously, I think about 2 years ago, actually showed that despite the number of parish councils we have in most parish councillors around the city, only 2 parish councillors actually had a contested election. And therefore, what we're talking about is putting £600,000 of taxpayers' money in the hands of some people that haven't fought a contested election. And therefore, I do worry about the democratic accountability around that. But that may be more about saying what the benefits of parish councils are to ensure more people stand for that.
And if you haven't got one, it's even more incentive to stand.
We have a question about food banks. Great things. Too many demands and council not putting sufficient resources. Do you agree, Gary?
Food banks, great things if people are hungry, terrible things because we should never need them in the first place. And I'm not sure I can say a whole lot more than that at the moment. But we clearly need them right now where we stand. But let's please not get into a position where they become a permanent fixture of the city, because they just shouldn't be. There shouldn't be a need for them.
Anybody else have any?
There shouldn't be food banks in the city. This is a wealthy city, you know, and I'm proud that the unemployment rate is going down so much, but that hides in-work poverty. You know, the number of people going to part-time work is doing full-time. The real incomes are going down. The energy costs and their house prices in terms of mortgages and rents are going up. And people are relying on food banks. And it's just criminal. It shouldn't be happening. And I worry that it ends up becoming a staple of a welfare society like it is in America. And it shouldn't be. And therefore addressing those wage levels, addressing those types of jobs is important. We're very supportive of the food banks. We've helped work with them to locate storage for them, because I know there's a couple of them now. And when they did their first kind of picket in Acre, I got on the bus immediately, went down and bought some stuff for them. They do great work in this city. They're not just giving it to people who, you know, are drinking and smoking and spending their money inappropriately. They're giving it to people who are really, really struggling.
Okay, we're running out of time, so I'm going to ask you a last question, which has 2 parts to it. Both parts carry equal marks. And can be answered,
Scorecard, yeah.
And can be answered more or less in a single word for each. Should Richard III be brought back to York, and if so, where should he be buried? If anybody says a car park on Nursery Lane. Okay. Well.
I have to say, I don't have particularly strong views on it, but it sort of feels right that it comes back, but I really don't feel very strongly one way or the other.
Well, we bring people back who fought in Afghanistan and other places, and I don't see why he shouldn't be brought back here if that's the wishes of his family, to be honest.
Brilliant.
Buried in Minster, yeah.
Yeah, it's funny that, isn't it? Where does somebody go from being a dead and loved relative? How old do they have to be before they then become a sort of something to do with heritage and tourism instead? I'm not quite sure what the age is, but I would probably go with Andy that if some genuine family can actually be traced, they would say.
We're going to ask this to Ian, but I'm worried about following up the phrase an old and loved relative, so there's no...
Yes, he should be brought back to York. He's a son of York and should be buried. I would say the most appropriate place is the Minster. I can just leave it at that.
James?
Yes, he should. The family have been found, and it's their wishes also that he's buried and interred in York. I would normally say the Minster, but the Dean of the Minster has expressed a view that doesn't really want to get involved in that battle as such.
She's from Leicester.
And therefore, you know, he's staying out. So it's now, there's a question over whether Minster's still the best appropriate place. But I think it should be definitely in York.
Keith?
It's nice to end on a question that we all agree on. Yes, I agree, and I do think the Minster is the most appropriate place.
Well, I've changed my mind now, so I'm only joking.
I actually think you agreed quite a lot on the first question from where I sat, although the local politicians don't always get it right. I think one of the things that is great on these occasions is to say thank you to the people who do put effort into trying to make York a great place, whether it's through political office, whether it's through voluntary work, whether it's through representing and promoting the interests of the business community, whether it's students who are interested in the next generation and putting their efforts behind what's going on in this place. And one of the biggest challenges we all have, I think, is getting people involved, engaged. They won't always agree, but to actually put that effort into investing time in their communities, I think is something. And I think all of the panelists here to say thank you to them for what they do in their various guises. Occasionally disagree slightly, but what they do in those various guises. And it's a pretty thankless task, as I say, it's about local democracy week, and there are few jobs in life where your fate depends on other people as much as your own efforts, I think, and you'll never make everybody happy all of the time, otherwise you wouldn't need them. But a huge thank you, I think we can thank them in the usual way, then that would be great. A big thank you for you coming out, and safe journey home. If you can now go over Lendal Bridge, if you thanks ever so much, everybody.